Hello and welcome to SFDC Sessions for the week of June 8th, 2020. My name is Alisa Carroll and I'm editor-in-chief of Henry Magazine. Today we're so privileged to speak with the artist and lighting designer Alison Berger, whose sculptural glass pieces go beyond casting light to become vessels for poetry and spirit. Inspired by art and nature, instruments of science, and artifacts of ritual, for the past 25 years, Alison has used light and glass to explore the philosophical and aesthetic questions that drive her. As always, our many thanks to the SFDC and Rhonda Harada for providing us with this platform for education and exploration. As a writer, I've always really resonated with your use of text as one of the touchstones of your process. And you say you start each piece by understanding the true definition of its words, or whether that's the title or the subject of the piece. And I wondered, why is that? Does it feel grounding to connect with a word, or is its etymology inspiring?
I think language is so important to me. I'm so literal. Like if you tell me something, I'll be like, what does that mean? Is there like meaning behind the meaning of what you just said? So like I'm a very literal person. So by looking up the definition, even no matter how abstract the idea is, I have to first ground myself in like the most concrete definition of what it is. Often the definition will kind of give a direction for an abstract interpretation. So it is really grounding. It's really simple to kind of just begin with, like, I think, it's also this kind of like, what does the word mean? Like you may have a definition and I may have a definition. So I want to have a common thread that's like, here's the definition I'm beginning with.
Yes.
It's like, for example, if you think something's beautiful and I think something's beautiful, we may not be syncing up with that. So it's the idea of like, that's why I often say to people, what do you mean? That's how I mean I'm literal. Like, what do you mean that's beautiful? How's that beautiful to you? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's actually beautiful the way it is to me as well. So I feel like language is so important because if you can't define it, I can't make it. And that's also the definition.
So having that level of clarity when you start is important. Yeah. And when you say sometimes in the definition, you might find a trace of something to use in the piece, are you inspired by, for example, something that might derive from, you learn all of it, for example, derived from something in French medieval text? Would that ever impact what you do next?
Correct. I mean, so often it's like you look at the word, then the words that are similes to it, then the etymology of it. And then I fall down these rabbit holes of history when I start working on it.
Yeah.
It's like, what was going on then? Because I'm so interested in societies and the rites and rituals that they used in all different times and periods and what those rituals say about society at that time, then I'm like, oh, this is what was going on historically. This is the information that created that word. And, it can come from a medical condition. It can come from a psychological, like there's so many reasons where words become born.
Absolutely. And I love that you reference ritual, and often ritual is a way of invoking the invisible or instantiating something in an object or a ceremony. And you speak so often about the invisible, that glass is a lens to the unseen world. So I wondered why you strive to make these forces and energies visible.
Well, for me, the invisible is always here. I mean, we can say it's invisible, but it's not really invisible. It's just tuning into the wavelength of what is around us that we just aren't, or maybe that I see it and I want you to see it too. So there aren't things that are invisible, just in the same way that, like, when you hear a new word, or you see a different color, suddenly you see that color everywhere. You hear that word being used. It's like, I've never heard that word before. In the last weeks, I've heard 10 people use it. So I don't feel like I'm making things that are invisible. I'm using the invisible. I think I'm making the visible more visible. That vibration of what's already there, I'm just calling it forward. I'm bringing it more into the presence. And that's important to me because I think the subtleties of what's around us are so, particularly with light, are so healing. I think, light has so much of for me, it's a healing property. I've always been drawn to the light. And so that idea that I'm calling forward different periods of the day and creating different moments of light may be unseen, but we all notice it, but we're not aware of it.
Right. And you have cultivated, right, an acute awareness of that throughout the
Yeah.
course of your practice. Right. And you know, another element of that I find so beautiful is you also have this really intense awareness of time in all of its dimensions. So you talk about, you know, obviously the time that you dedicate to conceptualizing and developing a piece, but also where it falls within sort of the temporal progression.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, because I'm so fascinated by those devices from the 16th century, the Galileo, all these instruments that started to be created that were describing the unseen becoming seen. So there were these instruments of like, all of a sudden, here's a barometer. What's a barometer? Oh, you mean like when the air pressure changes? We didn't even know what that meant. So things that were God-given became scientifically interpreted. And that's such a well I pull from. So it can be the idea of scales or pulleys or ballasts. And then of course the idea of time. Like that's so incredible that there used to be sundials. I mean, like something that's so abstract that there's actually an instrument to calibrate time. And then I started thinking about time on this whole other level, that like light is time. Light is just the most simplest version of time. You know, because you know, obviously day to night, but also the, you know, waning of sunlight and the transition and the golden hour and like all these periods. Like if you could make a clock that actually described different periods and qualities of light throughout the day, that would be like a really beautiful interpretation of time.
That would be, yes, amazing. And you also talk about the fact that you know, when you strive for timelessness in your pieces, it's often because you've drawn on something ancient, right? And you've transmuted it through your contemporary perspective into something that's then going to live on again in time, into a new phase. So, right, it's dwelling in between time and in time, and yeah.
Exactly. So the idea is like looking to the past and then using that as inspiration and then reinterpreting that to its essence. So it's almost like the perfume version of the thing I was looking at, so that just peripherally you get a sense of it. And then the idea that these moments, these pieces are holding these fragile moments of time. So like maybe I'm capturing 3 p.m. winter light, but I'm holding that 3 p.m. winter light for hours. So now all of a sudden time has stopped, time has been transmuted. Time isn't transient, it's actually held in these containers and volumes of crystal and bronze.
Yes. And you know, Alison, you speak so beautifully about memory really being your medium. And I grasped that in different ways, but now I see so in such a crystalline way what you mean. So when you say you've created a light that projects perhaps like a 3 p.m. winter light, right? It's almost like when they take a sample in an ice core and those air bubbles have saved, right, that moment of air from millions and millions of years ago. It's a beautiful capture of a memory.
Exactly. And this idea of like, just, you know, think about like, it just becomes like this, you know, this flip book of ideas and moments you can create. Because for as long as I can remember, I've been drawn to light. For as long as I can remember. And it's like, whether it was the glowing light of a firefly, or the golden hour of the sun setting, or light reflecting off water, or light passing through the branches of a trees, or light revealing a spider web that wasn't there 3 minutes ago. I've always tracked the light. And I don't really, you know, there's such a connection to that light and time, and wanting to take that moment of a golden hour and just hold that in time. So that's why the light's very healing. That's why the quality of the light, the atmospheric condition, the presence. I mean, yes, I have to say that I work with lighting because we have to give it a category. However, I feel like that category doesn't really define what I do, because I'm abstracting time through light. And I understand that the audience and where it lives is in the architecture interior world. And that's beautiful, because I don't think there's anything more important than creating a sacred environment for your home. And so I feel that, you know, particularly what we've been going through the past several months, it's like, for me, I'm really seeing my home as my sanctuary. And so I want to have this nurturing rekindling of a space that kind of then brings me out into the world.
Yes.
That's a
Yeah.
long answer.
And what did you say?
That was a long answer.
It's a fabulous answer. And it's interesting because you have talked about our craving of the natural world right now. And there's the idea of the sublime, right? The natural sublime, when a light or a physical experience becomes so overwhelming that you are out of mind, out of time. It's just a sublime experience, right? So it sounds like you're trying to capture a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, I'm trying to first of all, I'm trying to do it for myself. First of all, I'm trying to slow down. I'm trying to be present. I'm trying to be what's exactly in front of me and not ruminating about the past or worrying about the future. So if I can look at something that's beautiful and connect and hold time for a moment and be present, then that's what's sublime to me. Because in this moment, we have more than we need. In this moment, everything's perfect. It's this idea that, it's not enough because I'm thinking about tomorrow or I'm on. So the work for me is about really claiming the space of now, really calling in the present, really taking a moment to pause, taking a moment to see the beauty.
Let's talk a little bit about the calling and your process, because you said you first came across glass blowing when you were 15.
Yes. Yeah. I was always kind of like making things as a kid, and I came across this like glass blowing studio in Texas. I was like riding my bike down an alley. First of all, I always loved fire. I always loved fire. So I'm always like lighting matches as a kid, and maybe there was a little bit of a burned down kitchen at one point that we don't have to go into. But yeah, I've always loved fire. And so I'm riding my bike down an alley, and I like see fire flicking through like a chain link fence. And I literally scale the fence, and I'm like, what are you guys doing? And they're like, hey man, we're like blowing glass. So it was like a funky, late 70s glass blowing studio, stained glass. And I come home and I'm like, I want to take a class here. Great. Stop playing with fire at home, go do it somewhere else. And like, it's weird. I loved it.
Yeah.
Immediately. I was drawn to it immediately. I didn't understand that you could go to school for it. So then I went, when I graduated, I studied archaeology, and I started studying different disciplines. And yet whatever city I moved to, I kept coming across these glass shops, and it was the weirdest thing. So I'm in school full time at a college, and I find this course to take, and I'm there all the time. And they're like, what are you doing? Are you in college somewhere? And they're like, you actually can go to school for this. I was like, what do you mean? They're like, yeah, there's a school called Rhode Island School of Design. And I like dropped everything and applied and got in. And then it was just like, my world opened up. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, yeah. Serendipity is all about, right, being prepared and in the right place. So after you studied at RISD, you studied architecture at Columbia.
Right.
And you were making vessels and objects. At what point did you transition into creating lighting?
Well, very briefly, it's like I was working in New York doing architecture, and then I came out to Los Angeles and was working in architecture. I thought I just was coming out here for a minute. Like most New Yorkers are like, yeah, I'm just going to come out here for a minute, because it would be nice not to have to wear socks for 10 months, of the year. So, and then before I left, I started doing set design for films, and I always wanted to do that. I was like, I'm here in LA, I'm going to leave in the fall, so I want to start doing things on sets. So again, while I was working in architecture here in LA, I came across another glass studio. So suddenly I'm working full-time in architecture, but then I'm also making pieces on the weekends, or, I'm like, again, like just literally came across it. Didn't know anywhere in LA, and came across this glass shop. So now I'm like transitioning into set design, and I start designing pieces. And I wasn't aware that in set design, you go to set houses and buy everything or rent them. So I started designing things that didn't exist. And so the directors were saying to me, where are you going to get that? And I was like, oh, I'll make it. So I started making pieces for sets. The pieces started selling off the sets, like the actors would want them, or the directors. And then I just, that's where the objects initially began. And then all during that time, I've always been making lighting, except that it wasn't lighting, it was fireflies, or it was trying to keep a star in a jar, or it was whatever metaphor I was using at the time. But so the objects and the lighting were always interwoven together. There wasn't one or the other.
Right. And you've become such a curator of the many sources and qualities of light. And, you've referenced a few that I think are so intriguing, one of which was the film Barry Lyndon. And I don't know if this is something that you worked on, but you said the only source of light is candlelight, smell of beeswax, and seductive materials. And then you went on to create a piece, which is such an anachronism in this day and age, and that's part of why it's so wonderful, that is lit partly by, am I correct, candles, and partly by electricity.
Yeah, I love the idea of ritual. Ritual is so I'm inspired by ritual, objects of ritual, whether it's a locket or a vial that you collect tears in to share a memory. So of course I want the lighting itself to be ritualistic. And that's also, a spiritual context of, in Judaism, there's the Ner Tamid, which is the everlasting light at the altar. So there's all these metaphors that kind of get woven in. And so I wanted a piece that had that, what my fantasy was of what the film of Barry Lyndon smelt like. Of course, like you imagine perfume of everybody, but just like this rich smell of like beeswax candles just is so, calming to me. So yeah, the piece we created is a combination of electric light and electric candlelight and actual candles.
And not to digress, but one of the things I would imagine is of interest is all of the different qualities of light throughout time, depending on what was being used or what was available at the time, right? So the idea of when Paris transitioned from lamplight to electric light, and how that must have been so different from 20th century versus 19th century painters, or so how fun to get to experiment with creating all those kinds of light.
Yes, exactly. And then still wanting to capture, like while I'm creating all these different lights, I still want to contain and hold that atmospheric, healing, contemplative light. So it's always about, it's so primal, this idea of being attracted to fire or candles, or so that I'm always kind of returning back to because fire transforms. So this golden amber color, this idea of like this, the golden color of the light, even through the more recent LED pieces I've done, I can't lose that vibration just because the technology has changed. So it is about evoking a particular time, even if it's the 21st century overlaid with 17th century inspiration.
Right. You've said how rigorous your process has been to try and retain that quality of light using LED. So yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Took years.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like everything we do takes years.
Everything worthwhile takes years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It takes years.
So do you mind if I ask you about a couple of specific pieces that had stories that were so magical?
Oh, wow. I'd love to hear what you connected with.
I thought that the aura pendant was such a source of the idea of transcendence, because you have this, it's completely clear, right? But it is at the same time, it's embodied. So it's kind of a metaphor, right, for hopefully our own experience. But you had said it's also something that fascinated you because you love lockets. And that's where, can you tell us the story of finding the pieces inspiration?
Yeah, I would love to. I often will find things in flea markets, and then, I'm the one with the vendor going, tell me the history of this. And they're like, I'm gonna sell some stuff. And so I'm like, come back later and then we'll sit and talk. And so there was a period like the Victorian era, the idea that a locket, I found this locket, and just the idea that it's a memory you hold close to your heart. Like that's so powerful. So that this was actually something that was part of the jewelry vernacular at that time. And I thought, okay, so that's a hidden memory. And then I came across a locket that was actually all crystal. And I was like, wow, the memory is exposed. So I started working on the piece thinking I was creating a locket and being inspired by that. But see, what happens with this material glass, even after all the years I've worked with it, I can never predict the optical outcome of what's going to happen. I think I know what it's going to do, and I'm always surprised. So we made these pieces. We had 2 carved, 12-pound, 15-pound sections of carved glass for each half of it. And it was called the locket. And then one night I came into the studio and there was a rainbow cast on the wall from it, from the illumination. And I was like, that's the aura, that's the piece's aura, that's the animism of the piece. That's the piece coming alive, because we've imbued our energy into it, and now the piece has a life of its own. And I couldn't believe when I came in and I was like, where's this rainbow coming from? And it was like, the piece was just like, ah. I was like, oh, you're not a locket, are you? You're an aura. You're projecting an aura of like all the colors that are like the composition of it, the spectrum of an aura.
I didn't think of that, even the spectrum, right? The whole range of emotions and experiences that are captured in that clear white light. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, there's also another one that centers around the heart, which is body and heart. And you said that it originated with some Egyptian amphora.
Yeah. So it created it again. So I always begin I often look historically or at nature. So it began with the amphora. I mean, these are beautiful Egyptian forms that were used to hold wine or oil, and then later became, sacraments for, when someone would die. So they would, put containers of people's lives in these very figure-shaped vessels. So, and then I created this piece that's out of solid crystal of the heart, where it's glowing a golden light. And for me, it's about the heart's persistence to carry on despite adversity, despite, being broken, that, your heart continues to glow. And so the body of the amphora then is cut and polished in a way where it's open. So now we have an open heart. We have an open container. So when your heart's open, there's infinite possibility of what can happen. And so that's kind of all the meaning that starts getting imbued in the piece. And that's the meaning of that.
And now you're creating, if you can speak about it, you're creating a new piece that is a platform almost for maintaining an open heart, right?
Right.
Speaking about this piece, yeah.
Yeah, just from coming from this time, and that we're in such a healing place, that there with the virus, I just feel like it's such an opportunity to heal, have a shift of consciousness, awareness around the planet, and awareness around, again, this idea that our home is our sanctuary. So I started to think about bringing nature into a piece that would almost act as an offering. So it's just an idea right now, but it's the idea of, again, candles, incense, flowers, all suspended within a piece of illumination. So the ritual of dressing the sculpture, dressing the fixture, putting flowers in it, when to choose to light it, when to choose to have the incense. The idea that an altar or an offering is above your head, if it's at a table or maybe floating in the room, it just becomes a way to kind of honor nature and honor where we are as a planet.
Yeah, and offer gratitude, obviously, for the beauty and
the reverence.
Absolutely.
The deep reverence, yes.
And after all of these years of your work, you still find sort of the tools for pursuing your intellectual and aesthetic and spiritual questions in glass and in light. And you said, there are so many great metaphors for that. I wondered if you could share just some closing thoughts around that.
Around the metaphors for light?
I think you had said, it's fascinating after all these years, I'm still captivated by light, whether it's namaste or I'm sending you light. I think you kind of just answered that in the last question, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I continue to be fascinated by the physical properties of light, how it can hold memory because of the way that it changes and transmutes throughout the day. Like memory, it's kind of not there, and then all of a sudden it shows up. You're like, oh, I remembered, and you actually have the physical experience of it. And then the idea that the metaphor of light has so many meanings to it. Like we're all energy and we're light, and there's these beautiful prayers of like, I'm sending you light.
Yeah.
The light in me recognizes you, and that we're all on this wavelength.
Yeah.
And it's about like finding light and supporting. So this feels like to be working in light it's just the one layer of the work, but it's so important to me that it continues to have a different interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah. And how I love that you talk about wavelength and light wave and all of these ideas of sort of bringing a community to you and imbuing that community with light, right? Anyone that resonates with what you do, probably shares that value system. So it's a nice way of creating a community.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I've heard that the work, but someone, I mean, I think this is true with anything. If you connect to it, you connect to it. So the work finds its own audience. It doesn't, I don't have to, I think that's why it's so nice that it's so quiet.
Yeah.
And that's why it translates into day and to night. Like, I'm not about trend, and I'm not about like, what's the new thing and what's this. It's really about this deeper connection to a wavelength of beauty, a wavelength of sacredness, a wavelength of being in pause and in presence. And that's the work. So
right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for bringing us into that.
Thank you.